This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there and welcome to Global Business Africa. We'll be giving you insight into Africa's business and financial markets. I'm Uche Okoronkwo coming to you from Kenya's capital, Nairobi. Let's start with a look at today's markets. Now, it certainly was a bloodbath across markets today. We saw global stocks plunging as crude oil tumbled as much as 33%. And that's after Saudi Arabia launched a price war with Russia. Now, MSCI's index of developing world equities lost 4.4% on the day, giving up all its gains from last week. On the continent, South Africa's JSE All Share fell almost 6%, with declines across miners to financial services and even retailers. Petroleum firm Sasol lost 46% today. Mining firm Glencore down almost 13%. MTN also losing 12%. Now, amongst financial services, Standard Bank, FirstRand, Sanlam amongst those that lost more than 5% of their value today. In Nigeria, the All Share slipped just over 2%. Of course, oil firm Corn Oil did fall almost 10% today, but the banking sector was particularly hit. It saw Stanbic, Zenith and GT Bank falling 10% today. Now, also coming up on today's show. Trading in U.S. shares is halted after a sharp fall in stock prices. A row between Saudi Arabia and Russia cuts oil prices by nearly 30%. And East African banks' earnings feel the heat of growing bad debts. Now, financial markets around the world crashed today on the back of northern Italy being sealed off. Authorities in the European nation are struggling to contain the spread and impact of the deadly coronavirus. Tens of millions of people are now in virtual quarantine worldwide, but there are fears that the disease will spread further and that disruptions could force several economies into recession. Now, Asian stock markets were gripped with fear as the trading week opened with some of the heaviest falls since the global financial crisis of 2008. Equity markets fell more than 5% in Tokyo and 7.3% in Sydney, wiping hundreds of billions of US dollars off the value of companies and compounding weeks of losses. Well, turning to the oil sector now, the International Energy Agency says that global oil demand is set to contract in 2020 as a result of the coronavirus outbreak. Now, the energy watchdog expects demand to be 99.9 million barrels per day this year, 1 million barrels lower than its previous projection. However, the IEA also says that oil consumption will bounce back by 2.1 million barrels per day in 2021. Now, the downward revision comes as crude oil prices plunged 30% on Monday, following Saudi Arabia's decision to step up production and slash its official selling price. Saudi's decision was made after a deal between the OPEC and its allies, led by Russia, collapsed in Vienna last week. Now, as a result, Saudi Aramco shares fell 10% on Monday. The energy company shares in Aramco were trading at $7.20, over 15% below their IPO price. That came as Saudi Arabia slashed its official selling price for crude and set out plans for a dramatic increase in oil production next month. Meanwhile, Saudi stocks also fell over 9%, while international bonds issued by Saudi Arabia and Aramco also plunged today. Aramco bonds due in 2049 were down more than 8 cents, while Saudi government bonds maturing in 2049 dropped by more than 9 cents. Now, of course, the free fall in oil also reverberated across financial markets. Let's get more on today's market performance. We're joined by Jade Barker. She's in New York. Great to have you on the show with us, Jade. Now, of course, markets have not seen this kind of sell-off in a while, with the coronavirus outbreak adding another layer of uncertainty going forward. How long do you expect to see market players, or rather today's hysteria in markets lasting? Could it get get as bad as the financial crash of 2008?
Well, Uche, according to analysts we've been speaking to, anything is possible at this stage. We're really only in the first inning of this, so it's difficult to say what will exactly happen. But what we do know, of course, is that we now have three big players, Russia, Saudi Arabia and the US, all competing. And on top of that, we have this sliding demand due to the coronavirus, so it's not a good combination. And this is what makes it quite unlike 2008 or any other meltdown in crude oil that we've seen before, because this time you really have it from both sides. It's not just a supply issue, it's also a demand one. So analysts we spoke with do think that this could get worse, especially with the coronavirus devastating demand from China, of course, the world's largest importer of crude oil. But with it being such an unprecedented situation, it's difficult to predict exactly what will happen and how this will all play out.
Well, Jade, of course, today's sell-off was spurred on by the breakup of that OPEC Plus alliance that, of course, triggered an all-out price war in the oil market. The IEA itself, pretty stumped. It says the situation has no equal in oil market history. So is that OPEC alliance doomed going forward? What happens next with that?
Well, I wish I did have a crystal ball, but I think that doomed is a bit of a strong word. If history is anything to go by, OPEC has weathered worse storms than this before. Take the Gulf War, for example. But what this is likely to cause, and has already started to cause, is a fight for market share. The collapse of the deal means OPEC members and non-OPEC producers, of course, can in theory pump at will in an oversupplied market. Now, Saudi Arabia says it plans to boost its crude output above 10 million barrels per day in April once the current deal to curb production expires at the end of this month, as you mentioned earlier. That's according to sources who spoke to Reuters. Now, to put that in context, the country has been pumping 9.7 million barrels per day, but it has a capacity of 12 million BPD, so it can swiftly increase its production. Analysts believe we could see other OPEC producers such as Iraq, Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates follow Saudi Arabia's move, with steep cuts to their own oil prices next month. But other analysts we spoke with believe that Russia will return to cooperating with OPEC by autumn if prices remain very low, as President Putin will be reluctant to run down financial reserves too far to fund an expanding deficit. Now, if Russia continues to refuse to play ball, on the other hand, then this would effectively and fatally undermine OPEC Plus's ability to play the role of oil price stabilizing swing producer.
Now, what does this all mean for the oil price going forward? Traders such as Goldman Sachs say that we could see it fall to as low as $20 a barrel in the future. Is that the consensus amongst oil analysts?
Well, analysts we spoke with, such as Bob Yorga from Mizuho, said he doesn't think it's going to get that dire. His worst case scenario is $25. Of course, the last big low we saw was in 2016, and that was just above $26. So if it does get to the $25 mark, that is still worrisome. Once we get the full measure of all this, it could keep going further, because keep in mind that right now all we have are announcements. We don't even have the oil in the market yet. So as a result of that, we're waiting on what else will happen. Once that does happen, we could see the price of oil continue to decline. Saying that, though, some analysts don't see prices going much lower than that $25 number. Global demand is around 100 million barrels today. The International Energy Agency came out today and said that oil demand is set to contract this year for the first time since 2009, cutting its annual forecast by almost 1 million barrels per day. And while that's certainly going to sting, it still means there's going to be demand for an estimated 99 million barrels. And so analysts we spoke with were confident that this could also reverse out eventually and rebalance sometime in the near future.
Well, of course, the oil price collapse that we saw today, that shook the energy industry. But how exactly is it expected to impact oil-dependent nations and, of course, global politics going forward?
Well, this could have a lot of reverberations, both positive and negative. Demand for oil is going down due to the coronavirus, and you also have prices dropping. So if you're an oil-dependent nation, this might actually spell good news for you. But of course, on the other hand, if the industry continues to go into turmoil, it could be harder to get your hands on oil. Now, in terms of geopolitics, the failure of talks may have far further reaching implications, as OPEC's de facto leader, Saudi Arabia and Russia have used oil talks to build a broader political partnership in the last few years, after effectively supporting opposite sides of the Syrian war. And analysts say the latest developments won't just result in higher oil price volatility, but geopolitical volatility too. Now, Russia's finance ministry announced earlier today that the country could weather oil prices of $25 to $30 per barrel for between 6 and 10 years. The ministry said it could tap into the country's national wealth fund to ensure macroeconomic stability if low oil prices linger. So we're really seeing Russia take quite a strong stance here, making any future negotiating quite difficult. Now, beyond Moscow and Saudi Arabia ties, plunging oil prices will put pressure on US shale producers whose output costs are much higher than those of Russia and Saudi production, even though many shale producers are well hedged against price falls. A JP Morgan analyst said that this crisis has revealed that Saudi is not willing to keep a floor under shale and other producers. They're expediting the slowdown on shale. President Trump, on the other hand, has been trying to put a positive spin on all this, saying that the associated plunge in oil prices would benefit Americans, tweeting today that it's good for the consumer, gasoline prices coming down.
Well, we're certainly watching. Many thanks, Jade, for your insights. Jade Barker joining us there in New York. Well, let's move on now to the coronavirus outbreak. The epidemic could cost African airlines up to $40 million in revenue this year. This is a potentially devastating hit to often struggling airlines that, of course, count on lucrative Chinese routes to fund their expansion. Now, airlines around the world have suspended or modified flights amidst the outbreak, which began in mainland China at the end of last year. It has now spread to more than 60 countries worldwide, and according to the International Air Transport Association, the global cost to the aviation industry is projected to be $29 billion this year. Now, IATA had already forecast before the outbreak that African airlines would make a loss of around $200 million this year, noting that Ethiopian Airlines had seen air travel demand decline by 20%. Well, let's move on now and take a look at our corporate headlines today. Indian vehicle manufacturer Mahindra plans to use Kenya as its African assembly hub. This as the firm aims to increase market share in both commercial and passenger segments. Now, Mahindra is this week set to unveil its first batch of locally assembled double and single cab pickup models. Already, there are 7 Mahindra pickup models and sports utility vehicles in Kenya's market. And Kenya's leading mobile services company, Safaricom, intends to supply excess power from its solar and wind stations to the national grid. The company uses solar and wind energy to power its base stations in the remote parts of Kenya. Back in 2019, energy laws were revised to allow companies and households on the national grid to supply excess electricity from solar or wind plants to the central power grid. Now, this new arrangement is referred to as net metering. Drivers of ride-hailing digital taxis are pushing Kenya's National Transport and Safety Authority to cap operators' commissions at 5%. Now, the drivers, through the Digital Taxi Forum, want the turnover tax retained at 3%, parking fees and business permits paid to city authorities to be capped at 2%, and drivers to be allowed to join trade unions, amongst other demands. In December 2019, NTSA capped the ride-hailing firm's commission at about 15% per trip, even as Bolt is currently charging at 20%, while Little Cab charges 19% amidst tough economic times in the country. And UK retail giant Tesco has agreed to sell its operations in Thailand and Malaysia for $10.6 billion. The supermarket chain has 2,000 stores across both countries under the Tesco Lotus brand, and it's selling them to Thai conglomerate CP Group. Now, Tesco says the sale will allow it to further simplify and focus its business. The retailer also says that $6.5 million of the proceeds will be returned to shareholders via a special dividend. And that is a look at our corporate headlines. Well, let us head into a quick break now. Still to come on the show. East African banks' earnings feel the heat of growing bad debts. And South Africa's retail giant ShopRite pledges to remain in poor-performing African markets.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Uche Okoronkwo. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
There's more to this place than just glorious landscapes. There's more to it than just, say, Table Mountain or glorious, endless salt flats. There's more to it than countries that are home to some of the deepest mines in the world. There is so much more to this place, even if it is home to some of the finest diamonds on the planet. It is the sheer diversity of the people who call Southern Africa home, and the relentless drive to make it a better place that make it so special. And we know that because this too is home. No one knows Southern Africa like we do. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Now, East African banks' earnings will come under pressure in 2020 owing to increased exposure to bad debts and government borrowing. Now, Moody's ratings agency says the banks will also be affected by uncertainty in the regulatory framework and weaker than expected economic growth in the country. Economists at the agency say non-performing loans are set to eat up profits, giving a dimmer expectation of dividends to shareholders. Kenya leads the pack with NPLs at an average of 12%. Tanzania is at 10%, Rwanda and Uganda at 5.6% and 3% respectively. Now, of course, later this week, the largest bank in the region by assets will release its full year results for 2019. Let's explore what you can expect, not just from KCB, or rather Kenya Commercial Bank, but also from Kenyan banks this year. We're joined by Mwathi Kilonzo. He's the head of Kenyan Equities Trading at EFG Hermes. Great to have you on the show.
Sure, thank you.
With us, Mr. Kilonzo. Now, of course, rate caps were in place for about 3 years. Give us a sense of who amongst those 10 listed banks emerged in best shape once we saw those taken away, and of course, who are the best positioned for the return to an open market?
Look, I think over the rate cap era, the banks that managed to reduce their cost of funding, so the banks that could mobilize deposits at a cheaper rate, are the ones that would benefit. So those are the likes of KCB, Equity, Co-op, because they have a large branch network and a large distribution network. So those were in a strong position. But also the banks had invested in IT and digitizing their channels, which reduces the cost of serving a customer. Which means that when rate caps were removed, but the central bank continued to cut interest rates and their margins were squeezed, at least they're actually earning a return because they are have a low cost of serving their customers.
But we did see double-digit jumps in bank shares, especially after those rate caps were removed. What is your take on whether that rally was overdone, especially because we've seen the CBK sort of holding the banks back from increasing their lending rates?
I would actually argue that the rally didn't go far enough. I mean, we were expecting KCB to get somewhere nearer to 90, so high 80s. Equity Bank also to rally strong. So actually, I think what you've seen is that the current risk-off trade that's going on globally has impacted the rally of these banks, and it's, of course, you can't expect them to be isolated. But I don't think it was overcooked. I think actually that there's still quite a lot of headroom for these banks because now they can price risk, they can actually grow.
Right. Now, of course, we're heading into results season for the banks. What's your outlook after, given your point of view, what's your outlook for those results, especially Kenya Commercial Bank? What do you think?
Look, I think when we look at KCB, we're expecting that to start to see some fruits from the rate caps being removed. Obviously, they were removed towards the end of Q4, so we're unlikely to see that. But it would be interesting to see what management says on their expectations of loan growth. I think that's an interesting one. Would like to know what they've done with their government book, because obviously we would see them unwinding treasury bills and start lending to the wider economy. So I think their expectations around that will be very interesting. And also to get a sense of what sort of demand they're seeing for credit, and also to see at what price that demand is as well. So I think those will be very interesting trends to see. I mean, we saw one of the banks that has released so far that they were expecting 10% loan growth this year, which is better than where private sector credit loan growth was. I mean, it was sort of in the high single digits. So if it grows to 10 and plus, that's a positive.
Well, especially looking at KBC, its shares have fallen about 13%. So what do you think is behind that drop, though? Do you think there's a more fundamental concern? Could it be that foreign firms are sort of fleeing the market?
I think preceding current events globally, you had a bit of profit taking, naturally. I mean, the stocks had moved quickly over the last 4 months. But now, given the environment, what you're seeing is that, given that the market is 60 to 70% driven by foreign portfolio managers, what you're seeing is a risk-off trade, and that usually hits the more liquid stocks. So these are the stocks that are easy to get in and out of. So that's where the price reacts. And you can see the flip side of that. When rate caps were removed, this KCB in particular was a name that moved very, very quickly. So you'll always see that it will be three names. It will be Safaricom, KCB, Equity, will be the sort of leading the charge on the way up or the way down.
Well, what are the main macro trends you're watching for this year that, of course, will inform the performance of banking stocks this year?
I think we need to see where interest rates come. We need to see where the shilling settles. We need to see also the global outlook is really important. If oil stays at the $30 level, clearly it's good for Kenya in the long term because we are an oil importer. So our import bill will go down. That's good. But at the same time, if Europe goes into recession, you're looking at flowers, you're looking at tea, you're looking at tourism. So some of our large exports actually will suffer. So it's I think this is a very cloudy outlook, and you can see the markets are pricing that in. It's very hard and it's very volatile. But I think we need to see what our key trading partners do, and we also need to see what the government does. Obviously, there are budget deficits to work out. We need to look at their spending, and we need to see how that evolves.
Well, we do have to leave it there. Many thanks for joining us in the
much.
studio. That was Mwathi Kilonzo from EFG Hermes. And moving on now, Africa's largest retailer says it's still committed to doing business on the continent, but it may have to close some of its operations. In results out recently, Shoprite said it had suffered further losses from its African operations. Shoprite has stores in about 14 nations across the continent, but only a handful realized a profit, while South Africa remains its healthiest operation. CGTN Sumitra Naidu spoke with Group CEO Pieter Engelbrecht and brings us this report.
Shoprite remains a leader in Africa, but it's had a tough time operating outside of South Africa.
A lot of it is cyclical. If one think about West Africa, the depressed oil price, and then the biggest issue remains the currency and exchange differences. If one take a place like Angola, currency devaluation has been 185% over 2 years. Plus last year in October we had a 14% VAT introduced for the first time. So the consumer in a place like Angola is really under pressure.
In 2016, Angola contributed over 60% of the non-RSA profitability. Despite being the biggest drag now, Engelbrecht believes Angola remains an important operation in the long term. Nigeria, though, remains a concern.
We were tracking quite well, and then with great disappointment when the 5th of September happened with xenophobia, and then we lost up to about 60% of our customers in that country. We haven't got all of them back. We ended the period at a negative 8%, and in that country, different to Angola, is there was much more legislative and structural changes in economy and from the legislator that impacted the way that one does business there. So we have to rethink our model there.
Shoprite says it will need to rethink its African strategy.
We're currently in reconsidering the way that we enter the different economies, and there is a specific one that we are reviewing and entertaining different proposals in terms of how we're going to go forward. Zambia, yes. We had a 14.7% local currency growth, very good. Local business is very sound, but once you convert that, you wipe out all of that, the good with the currency devaluation. We're still committed to the continent. We just not committed at all costs. And we are reviewing each of the countries. We have closed 5 stores in the last year. We did also, the immediate short term, of course, is to invoke cost savings. So we've renegotiated 17 of our rentals. We've been able to convert some of the rentals from dollar to local currency, and also some of the borrowings.
The retail giant says it's still bullish on Africa, but needs to work harder on navigating the tough terrain. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, South Africa.
Now, the first Uganda European Business Forum has kicked off in Kampala. The event is aimed at creating partnerships and easing business relationships between public and private enterprises in Uganda and Europe. The European Union is currently Uganda's 3rd major exporter market after the common market for Eastern and Southern Africa and the Middle East. Here's CGTN's Michael Baleke with more.
Uganda is seeking investments in commercial agriculture, energy, tourism, finance and information communication technology. But exploiting these investments requires huge amounts of money, so Uganda is looking to the EU.
So we need players, we need partners, we need collaboration, we need what we call FDI, foreign direct investment. People who have saved their money somewhere else, we need to convince them to bring it to our country, so that we can use it to exploit and improve and add value to these resources.
Uganda enjoys preferential market access to the EU market. This means the country's exports are not charged import duty, nor are they subjected to restrictions or quotas. The arrangement has been in place since the early 1970s.
I'm really delighted that Uganda and European Union are seeing eye to eye here. They are completely aligned, especially the private sector. The government has provided an enabling environment for so long, and we had not taken full advantage of it. Now we are rising to the opportunity.
Uganda's exports to the European Union largely consist of fruits, flowers and vegetables. In 2019, they were worth $497 million, up from $460 million in 2016. The European Union gives Uganda millions of dollars in donations every year in areas of infrastructure, rural development and agriculture. But Uganda says aid from Europe is not creating any impact and is seeking a new model of cooperation. The European Union has welcomed this idea, which they believe will strengthen the Uganda-EU economic alliance.
When you have a market which is free, a market which gives the opportunity to people to talk, to engage, to make investments and see bearings and fruits coming out of this investment, this is a unique opportunity. This is a very good market. So we are very happy about it.
The conference is being held amid the COVID-19 epidemic, and participants from France, Italy, Spain and Germany were told to stay home. But Uganda faces other hurdles too. Many food producers struggle to meet EU standards and can't always produce goods consistently. But Ugandan businesses hope European partners will see more opportunities than liabilities. Michael Balekesi, GTN, Kampala, Uganda.
Well, let's head to Tanzania now. The country has come under rare praise from the International Monetary Fund for what the global lender terms prudent legal reforms in its mining sector, land and microfinance. Now, these changes have seen mining's contribution to GDP rise to 5% from 4.8% the previous year. Gold and US dollar reserves grew above the country's benchmark, adequate to cover over 5 months of imports. Annual inflation trended below 4% for nearly 12 months, a stable exchange rate and an improved tax collection to nearly 96% of the target. Now, the lender is urging Tanzania to carry on with the targeted economic reforms. It has, however, advised authorities there to clear their business environment of barriers that, of course, will otherwise disrupt the economic stability the country has experienced in the recent months. And moving on now, Tuesday is the one-year anniversary of the Ethiopian airline crash that killed 157 people. Ethiopian investigators plan to release an interim report, which apparently has been circulated to U.S. government organizations. It blames Boeing for the March 2019 crash. A congressional report has also found a fault with the airline. Now, CGTN's Jagruti Dave reports.
An interim report into the March 2019 Ethiopian Airlines crash is expected to be released soon by Ethiopian crash investigators. A draft copy of the report has been distributed to US agencies who are taking part in the investigation. Sources have told both Bloomberg and Reuters that the draft report tentatively attributes the crash to the design of the now grounded Boeing 737 MAX. One of the agencies that's received a copy of the draft report is the NTSB, the US National Transportation Safety Board. Eric Weiss, NTSB spokesperson, says the board cannot comment on the contents of the report, which reportedly includes recommendations. Boeing also declined to comment on the contents of the draft report. This comes as a US House committee has published preliminary findings into its own investigation into the Ethiopian Airlines crash and the Lion Air crash, both of which were on Boeing 737 MAX planes. US lawmakers blamed what they called Boeing's culture of concealment and faulty assumptions about critical technologies in the Boeing 737 MAX. They also said the Federal Aviation Administration failed in its oversight responsibility to ensure people's safety. The FAA have said it's welcomed the scrutiny, and Boeing has said we cooperated extensively for the past year with the committee's investigation, and they said that they will review this preliminary report. Jagruti Dave, CGTN, Washington.
Now, to mark the first-year anniversary, Ethiopian residents who lived near the crash site have held a memorial service in honor of the fallen victims. Escorted by men on horseback, Bishoftu village elders walked to the crash site, prayed and poured traditional brew on the ground in a ritual they say is their way to mark the end of a mourning period.
The ritual we've just performed here is what we normally do as closure to end a mourning period. We've been in mourning for a whole year. We've been hosting people coming from various parts of the world, and it's been a tough mourning period for the entire nation.
We have been mourning since then. They are like our children. No difference. Their journey in life was just cut short, and they didn't plan for this. They didn't say bye to their loved ones. We also have kids like them, and this could happen to anybody's son. But today, we mark the first anniversary, and their chapter has to be closed.
What these people did is they were mourning for a whole year for people they have never met or never heard of, who lost their lives in this place in that tragic accident. It was them who collected body parts from this place and mourned for the dead. This shows how compassionate these people are.
Well, let's shift focus now. Households in cocoa growing areas are struggling with the realities of rural poverty. Some parents are now forced to put their children to work in order to reduce labor costs on plantations. This in turn deprives children of the chance to develop and advance themselves. Well, CGTN's Daniel Arap Moy now explores how one initiative is changing this in Côte d'Ivoire.
In Western Africa, cocoa is a commodity crop grown primarily for export. For example, 60% of Côte d'Ivoire's export revenue comes from its cocoa. As the chocolate industry has grown over the years, so has the demand for cheap cocoa. On average, cocoa farmers earn less than $2 per day, an income below the poverty line. As a result, they often resort to the use of child labor to keep their prices competitive.
It used to be difficult because when you can't give money to your child to go to school, sometimes the child refuses to go to school completely. And then if we have to go to the fields to go to work, we have to take the children to the fields to help us there.
But now things are set to change. Women in plantations around this village are turning to a network of small saving banks with the goal of protecting their children. The International Cocoa Initiative has been working since 2007 towards the goal of ending child labor in Côte d'Ivoire and neighboring Ghana.
We have set up what we have called the Feminine Cell for Economic Reinforcement. This is a village savings and credit association, as is done in most rural communities, with the fundamental difference that this association must be involved in activities that ensure the protection of children.
Empowered by working together, these women are also challenging traditions in a rural culture where the father of the family makes all the decisions.
It's great, I'm so glad. I'm proud for the women. I'm really happy with the decision they made. If things are not going well with us men, they are the only ones who can help.
Achieving success in the fight against child labor in the cocoa sector is a shared responsibility. Over the years, cocoa growing communities, governments and the global chocolate and cocoa industry have taken their fight against the act to a new and much higher level. They say the goal is to redouble efforts in order to ultimately eliminate what the International Labour Organization calls the worst forms of child labor. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN.
Well, let's head into a quick break now. Still to come on the show. China's foreign trade falls in the first 2 months of this year, weighed down by the coronavirus outbreak. And why are Singapore women earning less than their male counterparts? All that coming up.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant. Only on CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed.
And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
I'm Uche Okoronkwo reporting from Nairobi's City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference.
Here's a quick recap of today's top headlines. Financial markets around the world crashed on Monday on the back of an oil price war. Asian stock markets were gripped with fear as the trading week opened with some of the heaviest falls since the global financial crisis of 2008. Now, equity markets fell more than 5% in Tokyo and 7.3% in Sydney. Trading in U.S. shares was briefly suspended after sharp falls led to an automatic halt in the selling and buying of stocks. Once trading resumed, the three major U.S. stock indices were down over 6%. And 9 African nations are in the news tonight as coronavirus cases rise steadily, with 95 cases on the continent. So far, 1 death has been reported in Egypt. The North African nation has the highest number of infections in Africa, with 55 confirmed cases, followed by Algeria with 20 cases. Senegal has 4 confirmed cases. South Africa has just announced 4 new cases, raising its total to 7. Nigeria, Cameroon, Tunisia and Morocco each have 2 cases, while Togo has a single case. And Sudan's Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok is in a safe and secure location after surviving an assassination attempt in the capital Khartoum. Now, state radio says the Prime Minister's convoy had been hit by gunfire and a projectile. It is not yet clear who carried out the attack, but hundreds of Sudanese took to the streets to celebrate Hamdok's survival. And the United Nations envoy to Libya has announced that he will be stepping down, citing stress and poor health. For nearly 3 years now, Ghassan Salame has been trying to broker peace in Libya. During his tenure, he often faced criticism on his handling of the conflict. Now, Salame has repeatedly complained of the lack of cooperation from the international community, especially those backing either of Libya's warring sides. And that is a recap of today's top headlines. Now, China's foreign trade fell in the first 2 months of this year, weighed down by the coronavirus outbreak. That's according to official data released during the weekend. However, the impact of the epidemic is believed to be temporary. Wang Xing walks us through the details.
China's total trade volume fell 9.6% year-on-year to 4.1 trillion yuan in the first 2 months of this year. Exports tumbled nearly 16%, while imports contracted 2.4%, leaving a trade deficit at 42.6 billion yuan. The slump in China's foreign trade data came as no surprise to the market.
China's foreign trade took a hit from the coronavirus outbreak, as well as the Spring Festival effect. However, in February, export and import began to recover. We have seen increasing number of registration of foreign trade and rebounding transportation activities.
Private firms are now the major players in China's foreign trade, and they're more sensitive to market changes. But as China gradually contained the COVID-19 outbreak, more and more businesses have resumed operations since February. A pickup in foreign trade activities is expected in coming months. The Chinese government has taken a slew of measures to facilitate the resumption of foreign trade businesses, including speeding the clearance process and simplify related procedures. They also reported over 80% of the surveyed foreign trade companies have resumed work as of last week.
So hopefully, China is able to take very effective measures to pay a little economic price, but production can be resumed as soon as possible. And also the government, businesses, and workers can really work hard to make up the loss.
But experts caution the spread of COVID-19 outside China may bring more uncertainties to global trade.
The virus outbreak around the world is getting worse. It will increase the uncertainty to the world trade, weaken the outbound demand, and bring a lot of negative impact on supply chain.
Analysts say imports is likely to stay resilient due to strong domestic demand, but investors are closely watching the impact of the coronavirus on global economy, which may weaken external demand and hurt exports in coming months. Guanxing, CGTN.
Meanwhile, stores have gradually reopened in Shanghai, but rigid rules are being applied for visitors. Reporter Zhang Shixuan checks out the Douyin bookstore in the Shanghai Tower and finds out about the entry procedures.
Before going to the bookstore, you need to prepare 3 things. First, make an online reservation on its WeChat account 1 day in advance and save your reservation code on your phone. Second, bring your identification. Third, have your health QR code handy. I'm here at Shanghai Tower's second entrance, which is reserved for Douyin bookstore customers on its 52nd floor. Let's see how many procedures there are before entering the building. One of the guards at the gate first scans my reservation code and checks my ID card to verify the information. He then scans my health QR code. Later, my temperature is recorded. Last, he pulls some rinse-free antiseptic gel on my hands. Now I've got permission to enter. It shows that I'm the 7th person coming today, but it's just the first step. Most of the facade is covered with a rolling shutter, and it seemed empty with only a few customers wandering around, while normally up to 3,000 people per day were coming before the outbreak. And that's the only entrance gate. Visitors return their entry card at reception. The cards are disinfected immediately. The worker will then squeeze some rinse-free antiseptic gel on your hands. Finally, I'm in Douyin bookstore. Honestly, I was concerned about sanitary conditions, but here, I rest my case.
The bookstore is disinfected every 2 hours. Apart from the floor, tables, and bookshelves, we also sterilize all books that have been read by customers. There are carts beside the shelves for visitors to return the books. We also offer gloves to customers when they want to touch items in the cultural and creative area.
The bookstore has 3 reservation periods: 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., 1:30 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., and 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Visitors are capped at 270 on weekdays and 470 on weekends.
I have long desired to come here. I feel really safe. The bookstore requires an online reservation, health QR code, and also offers hand sanitizer.
There are checks at the beginning, and we should fill in our information. The bookstore looks clean. I feel relieved.
More than 2,000 bookstores are open, including Shanghai Book City and Xinhua Bookstore. The Shanghai Books and Periodicals Distribution Association has issued guidelines for those resuming business. Some take necessary steps to control customer numbers. When visiting a bookstore, remember to wear a mask and keep an adequate distance with others. Zhang Shixuan, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
And moving on, women in Singapore have made remarkable progress when it comes to education, employment and earnings. But they're still being paid less than their male counterparts doing the same job. Here's Miro Liu finding out why.
Women in Singapore earned 6% less than their male colleagues in 2018 for doing similar work in similar roles. The Adjusted Gender Pay Gap report released by Singapore's Ministry of Manpower took into account factors like education, age, and industry for their calculations. However, the unadjusted wage gap shows that the overall median monthly salary of a woman was 16.3% less than a man's, which is in fact higher than it was in 2002. Women's rights advocates believe that the unadjusted figure, which is widely recognized internationally, is a more accurate representation of the ground realities.
I think the larger number is probably more indicative of the reality on the ground, because the things that they adjust for almost normalize bias. And what the lower number doesn't do is it doesn't help us address that. It gives us a false sense of security. And we can only solve problems if we can identify them to begin with.
A crucial factor behind the pay gap is due to persistent gender norms and occupation segregation, whereby men tend to dominate higher paying jobs while women are overrepresented in the lower paying ones.
Why women might end up in lower paying roles has a lot to do with the fact that their role as the primary caregiver compels them to look for jobs that allow them the flexibility of balancing both. And these jobs usually would be part-time work or, kind of more flexible types of work that tends to pay lower as well.
Aware went on to add that shared caregiving responsibilities between both parents and additional paternity leave for fathers could help women better manage their dual roles. But undeniably, a more drastic change in mindset and workplace policies is vital to addressing the larger issue of pay disparity.
There's several things companies and countries can do. One is to encourage pay transparency. I think the more transparent wages are, the more likely we are to see an equalization for women. The second thing is blind hiring. You submit the same CV with a man's name and a woman's name, and the man gets selected, and it's exactly the same CV. So there is a lot of bias built into our system.
At the current rate, it will take women almost 100 years to earn as much as men, as per the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report 2020. Though voices are being raised and efforts are being made to bridge the gap, the time when equal pay is given for equal work, irrespective of gender, is still a far cry away. Miro Lu, CGTN, Singapore.
And shifting focus, here's a quick look at how commodities performed today. And all eyes were on oil today as prices lost as much as a third of their value. Now, prices are hitting levels last seen in 1991, and that's after Saudi Arabia signaled it will hike output in order to win market share, while, of course, the coronavirus has already left the market oversupplied. Now, traders do say the timing of this lower price environment should be limited to a few months unless this whole virus effect on a global market and consumer confidence triggers, of course, the next global recession. Meanwhile, gold prices continuing to climb today, on course for their biggest weekly gain since October 2011, as investors continue to rush to safe haven assets. You are watching Global Business Africa. Let's head into a quick break, still to come. A Nigerian startup introduces virtual reality into classrooms.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Now, virtual reality is shaping the modern world in terms of the experience it creates for users. A Nigerian startup has embarked on introducing it to the classroom now. This is part of its efforts to improve the quality of education and ensure emerging technology takes a firm hold in both Nigeria and Africa at large. CGTN's Deji Badmus has that story.
Imisi 3D is an extended reality creation lab based in a suburb of Lagos, locally regarded as the city's Silicon Valley. Founded by Uche Okoronkwo in 2016, the tech startup broadens access to the XR technology by growing a community of content creators and educating people about it through a touch and feel approach. IMISI 3D solution is particularly focused on working in specific important sectors such as education. The whole idea is to provide innovative education content through virtual reality, which will improve experiential learning for students with limited access to study aids.
If you go to a local public school, you'll easily have 80, 90 children in one classroom. They might not have laboratories, for example, for the sciences. It certainly means that they will not be able to afford going to field trips, in different parts of the country or the world. However, with a technology like virtual reality, you can set up a VR lab in the school. So you can have students do experiments in a virtual lab. You can have them do things like explore the pyramids of Egypt, or see the Eiffel Tower, all in VR.
With a computer, VAR headset, and camera, the VR experience creates a supplement to classroom teaching. The tech company has been working closely with a local secondary school in Lagos to get schools and students embrace the technology.
They can explore the solar system, so it's not just this abstract concept they're hearing about, but they can actually see the planets and manipulate them. They can be in the human body and move the human heart, things like that.
Already, the tech startup has been able to create custom content for the Nigerian junior secondary school curriculum in 3 subjects, courtesy of support from the UNICEF Innovation Fund. Over the past year, Okoronkwo and her team have been able to record tremendous successes with the technologies, particularly in the area of storytelling.
In the Forbes list of the best XR experiences of 2019, there were 2 Nigerian VR film projects, one of which was produced here. So we're seeing significant wins with the little that we've been able to do. I think we expect to see a lot more. If we get the uptake that we should have, if we have the right content, it will literally change education as we know it.
In most cases, the company has to provide required facilities for students by themselves, and this is one area that Okoronkwo wants policy drivers to pay attention to.
One thing that has been obvious for the last few years is that, the XR technologies are severely under-resourced in Africa. In setting up a space that we would use as a lab, we had to provide alternate power supply. We certainly had to make sure that there were places where we could have access to things like the internet for the headsets to update them when we needed to. And for us, that typically means bringing them back to the lab here to get that done.
The XR technology holds a lot of potential for education in Nigeria. For this reason, IMISI 3D also invests in building local content creators through scholarship offers and support for enthusiasts who are looking to start a career in augmented and virtual reality or other emerging technologies. But it will need a lot of push to make VR a common reality in every classroom in the country. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Well, before we go, here's a quick look at how Africa's currencies performed today. South Africa's rand tumbling to a 4-year low. It joined a global sell-off in riskier assets as, of course, the coronavirus outbreak continued to spread globally and oil prices collapsed today. Now, Kenya's shilling also weakening today due to a dollar demand from commercial banks beefing up their foreign reserves, outweighing inflows from diaspora remittances today. Well, that's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contacts on your screen. You can also follow us on our various digital media platforms. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.